Good afternoon. Today I would like to talk about the experience of the first man to have orbited around the Earth once, the Soviet spaceman, the Soviet space pilot called Yuri Gagarin. It was on 12th April 1961. Yuri Gagarin had woken up much before it was dawn, and he had worn his spacecraft. He had worn his spacesuit. He was he was going to be on a mission that would let him orbit around the Earth once. He was chosen for this mission. He was actually a pilot in the army before, and in the Soviet Union, he was chosen as the person to carry out this, to become a space pilot and carry out this mission. He knew that this mission was going to be a dangerous one because no one had ever been to space before, ever been to a region where they would feel weightlessness. In fact, many of the doctors at that time suspected if a human could even swallow in space. And the engineers who had worked on the spacecraft and all the other procedures of a space mission had embraced Yuri Gagarin, and they gave such an embrace that looked like they felt it was going to be the last time they're going to see Gagarin. It was on the date 12th April 1961. Nevertheless, after having this emotional goodbyes from his colleagues and the members of the people who worked in his mission, he had climbed onto his spacecraft and the countdown had begun. The spacecraft, first, let me describe a little about the spacecraft. The spacecraft consists of two parts. One part is in which the space pilot would be traveling on, and it was a ball spaced part. It was a kind of a round part. And the other part, which was attached to this part, the ball space part. The ball space part is called a descent module, and the other part which is attached to the ball space part was was something that would give the power supply to the spacecraft, and it also had certain rockets that would be used for maneuvering the spacecraft. It had the fuels that these rockets required. So the entire spacecraft was called Vostok. It was the it was called Vostok space capsule, and it was the first spacecraft to have a manned mission into space. So as I told you, on April 12th, 1961, Gagarin had climbed into his spacecraft and the countdown had begun. But there was a problem immediately. Gagarin was preparing for this mission for months together, and it was the time for a launching procedure, but the launching procedure would not start because a mission controller would come in contact with Gagarin while he was in the spacecraft, and he would tell him that the controller was not able to receive a signal that had said that the hatch or the door of the spacecraft was sealed. Hence, some rectification had to be done, and therefore the launch had to be delayed. It was a frustrating delay, but the technicians had started working on the problem, and soon the problem was rectified. The door or the hatch was replaced. Next, the countdown had once again begun. Before, firstly, it had started before the technical problem. Now it is continuing, and the spacecraft was on a launcher. A launcher is a device that helps the spacecraft to get far enough from Earth to ensure that the spacecraft does not fall back into the atmosphere of the Earth. And in this case, the launcher was an adopted nuclear missile. Once the countdown was done with, the launcher was was getting itself ready to launch, and it had started, and it was swaying dangerous. It was kind of swaying, and soon Gagarin would be flying, soaring higher and higher, and he would reach a point that no human or a spacecraft or an aeroplane, rather not the spacecraft, an aeroplane had reached in the past. He had reached a point 12 times the distance and highest a moving aircraft would have reached. At the same time, as he was speeding up, as he was soaring high and high, he felt the effect of gravity. The effect of gravity, as one speeds up, is more pronounced than if one was on Earth. On Earth, one would not feel as heavy as they would have felt if they were in a speeding aircraft, in a speeding spacecraft. So Gagarin, because of the pull of gravity, which was many times stronger than it would have been if Gagarin was on Earth, he was getting pushed back onto his seat. So after 9 minutes after the launch was complete, Gagarin would reach a place where he would not be affected by gravity and he would experience weightlessness. The rockets of the spacecraft would also be switched off at this point, and moreover, Gagarin did not have to operate any of the controls in the spacecraft, as they were to be operated from the ground itself by the mission control. So in effect, Gagarin could just sit back and relax, and also have a look at uh, the view of the Earth from the height he had reached, height that no one had ever reached before, and it was a view of the Earth that no one had ever seen before as well. And Gagarin told the mission control that Earth was so beautiful and there were clouds, and after some time he would be over the Arctic Ocean, and he would also be moving over America. In effect, he would completely orbit the Earth, and the orbit was quite a successful one. And the orbit got completed after 90 minutes. After 90 minutes, it was time to descend and come towards Earth. This time, the rockets had to once again fire, and this time the rockets had to fire in a direction that opposed the actual direction of motion of the rocket in the orbit around the Earth. So these kind of rockets are called retro rockets, that would oppose the actual motion of the spacecraft, which is actually going in a certain direction, in this case in an orbit around the Earth. So once the retro rockets were fired, the spacecraft was positioned in such a way that it would descend towards the Earth. But again, here there was a problem. Like we saw that there was a problem at the beginning, where the controller could not get the signal if the door of the spacecraft or the hatch of the spacecraft was closed. Here the problem was, as I told you, the spacecraft was made of two modules. The first module was where the space pilot was placed. In the second module, it was the source of main power supply to the entire spacecraft, and it also had rockets that could maneuver the spacecraft and the fuels associated to those rockets. So it had an instrument module and a descent module. A descent module is the ball space module, in which the space pilot was traveling. According to procedure, the descent module and the The instrument module had to separate while descending or just before the start of descent. But this was not to be. That was the problem. Because of that, what had happened is the spacecraft began to spin, it began to tumble, and it was quite dangerous. In fact, the interior of the spacecraft was getting more and more hot. It was getting dangerously hot. And since Gagarin was wearing a spacesuit and it was a thick one, Gagarin was feeling the heat. Gagarin also heard a crackling sound, a kind of sound of fire. And at that time, he got to know that the descent module and the instrument module had not detached themselves. He had also come in contact with the people in the ground, the mission control, through a voice link, and he was telling them that he was feeling the pull of gravity. I told you that at high speeds, the pull of gravity is much stronger than if a person stood on the earth. And because of such a strong pull of gravity, he told them that he was feeling uncomfortable. And the next moment after that, the voice link was lost, and the people in the mission control heard a loud explosion. But you need not worry about that loud explosion. Even before that, Yuri Gagarin had ejected himself from the spacecraft without waiting for the spacecraft to eject him automatically. So, in effect, he was safe. And after he was ejected, there was a parachute that would open over his head, and he had a few minutes to retrospect and to enjoy the silence and reflect on the achievement he had about rotating around the earth. And after some time, he had descended to the earth through the parachute, and he had become the first person to orbit the earth once, and he had become famous. He was recognized everywhere he went. I hope you found this story an experience of Yuri Gagarin, the first space pilot to have orbited the earth once. Firstly, he had to, just to summarize the entire experience once again, firstly, he had to, it was a dangerous mission. No one had ever been to space before. No one had experienced weightlessness. Some of the doctors felt that humans could not swallow in space. Some of his engineers had bad apprehensions about him. And despite that, he would brave all these odds and he would enter his spacecraft. There was a glitch. The mission controller would tell him that the door or the hatch, the signal relating to if the door was closed or not, would not come to him. And finally, the door itself was replaced, and then he would soar high in the sky, and the gravity would pull him as his spacecraft sped high and high into the sky. He did feel uncomfortable about that, and once he had started feeling weightless, he was free to relax a little and observe from his window. His window is called a pothole. To observe the earth, the clouds, and from a position where no one had ever observed earth. And then he had completed his orbit around the earth in 90 minutes, and after that it was time to descend. The two modules, the descent module and the instrument module, would not separate themselves as was the plan. And then Gagarin would feel extremely hot inside the spacecraft. The spacecraft was also spinning and tumbling. And then he decides to eject himself rather than waiting for the spacecraft to automatically eject him, which was the plan in the first place. So these were the experiences of Yuri Gagarin. Thank you.